Shy girl gets revenge on bullies who ripped her shirt after she said no to their date. A story by Heartfelt Tales. The sound of fabric tearing echoed through the crowded hallway like a gunshot, silencing hundreds of chattering students in an instant. Emma Chen stood frozen, her book-filled arms crossed protectively over her chest as her favorite lavender cardigan hung in shreds around her shoulders. The jeers and laughter that followed felt like physical blows, each one driving her deeper into the humiliation that threatened to swallow her whole. But in that moment of devastating vulnerability, something inside Emma shifted, something that would change not just her life, but the entire culture of Lincoln High School forever. Emma had always been the girl who preferred shadows to spotlights. At 17, she moved through the halls of Lincoln High like a ghost, her long black hair creating a curtain between herself and the world. She found solace in library corners, in the pages of classic novels, and in the art room where she could lose herself in watercolor landscapes that spoke the emotions she couldn't voice aloud. Her only real friend was Marcus, a fellow introvert who shared her love of obscure indie films and philosophical discussions over lunch in empty classrooms. The trouble began 3 weeks earlier when Derek Morrison and his crew, Jake Patterson and Tyler Brooks, had approached her after chemistry class. Derek was everything Emma wasn't, loud, confident, and surrounded by admirers who hung on his every word. He was the kind of guy who wore his popularity like armor, using it to shield himself from any real vulnerability or consequence. "Hey, Emma," Derek had said, leaning against her locker with that trademark smirk that made half the school swoon. "You're coming to my party this Friday, right?" Emma had barely looked up from her textbooks. "I don't really do parties," she'd mumbled, trying to squeeze past him. "Come on," Jake had chimed in, blocking her path. "Don't be such a hermit. Derek's asking you personally." The invitation had felt more like a trap than an honor. Emma had politely declined, but Derek's expression had darkened in a way that made her stomach churn. She'd seen that look before, on the faces of boys who couldn't accept that a girl might simply not be interested. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified. Derek would corner her between classes, his friends flanking him like bodyguards. They'd make comments about her appearance, her clothes, her quiet nature. When she continued to refuse his advances, the tone shifted from pestering to predatory. "What's wrong with you?" Tyler had sneered just days before the incident. "You think you're too good for Derek?" "Newsflash, sweetheart, guys like him don't usually bother with girls like you." Emma had tried to ignore them, to become even more invisible, but they seemed to interpret her silence as a challenge. She started taking different routes to class, eating lunch in the art room, arriving early and leaving late to avoid them. But Lincoln High wasn't that big, and Derek Morrison wasn't the type to give up easily. The morning it happened, Emma had been rushing to her AP literature class, her arms full of books and art supplies. She'd thought she'd successfully avoided Derek's usual haunts, but as she turned the corner near the main staircase, there they were. Derek, Jake, and Tyler, standing in formation like they'd been waiting for her. "Emma." Derek's voice boomed across the hallway, drawing attention from students who were already starting to form a curious crowd. "We need to talk." Emma tried to walk past them, but Tyler stepped into her path. "Don't be rude," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Derek's trying to be nice to you." "I'm late for class," Emma said quietly, her voice barely audible over the growing murmur of onlookers. "You're always late for everything that matters," Derek said, stepping closer. His cologne was overwhelming, aggressive. "Like my party. Like every chance I've given you to be somebody in this school." Emma felt the familiar anxiety rising in her chest, the way her breath seemed to catch and her hands began to shake. But this time, there was something else, a tiny flame of anger that had been building for weeks. "I said no," she said, louder this time. "That's a complete sentence." The crowd around them grew larger, sensing drama. Emma could see phones being pulled out, cameras being angled in their direction. Her worst nightmare was unfolding in real time. Derek's face flushed red. You know what your problem is, Emma? You think you're special. You think you're better than everyone else with your books and your art and your whole mysterious act. But you're not. You're just scared. Leave me alone, Emma said, trying once more to push past them. That's when Jake grabbed her backpack, yanking it hard enough to send her art supplies scattering across the floor. Paint tubes rolled under lockers, sketches fluttered like wounded birds, and her carefully organized notes became a carpet of chaos. Oops, Jake said with mock innocence. Looks like the princess dropped her crown. Emma dropped to her knees, frantically trying to gather her scattered belongings. She could feel tears threatening, the humiliation burning in her cheeks. But as she reached for a particularly important sketch, a portrait she'd been working on for weeks, Derek's foot came down on her hand. You know what, Emma? Derek said, his voice now loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. I was trying to help you. Trying to give you a chance to matter. But if you want to be a nobody forever, that's fine by me. Emma pulled her hand free and stood up, her scattered supplies forgotten. Something in Derek's tone, in the cruel satisfaction on his face, in the way the crowd was watching like she was entertainment, finally snapped the careful control she'd maintained for so long. I don't need your help to matter, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. And I don't need your approval to exist. The words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, Emma felt a surge of pride. She'd finally stood up for herself. She'd finally found her voice. But Derek's expression twisted into something ugly and dangerous. You're going to regret that, he said, and before Emma could react, his hands were on her cardigan, gripping the delicate fabric. The sound of tearing seemed to last forever. Emma watched in horror as her favorite cardigan, the one her grandmother had given her, the one that made her feel safe and pretty, split down the middle, exposing her simple white tank top underneath. The crowd gasped, phones clicked, and Emma felt the last of her composure crumble. But then, in that moment of absolute vulnerability, something extraordinary happened. Instead of running, instead of hiding, Emma looked around at the sea of faces watching her humiliation and felt a clarity she'd never experienced before. Is this who you want to be? She asked, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hallway. She wasn't looking at Derek anymore. She was looking at everyone. At the students holding phones, at the ones laughing, at the ones who looked uncomfortable but said nothing. She pulled the ruined cardigan tight around herself and stepped closer to Derek, who suddenly looked less confident. You think destroying my clothes makes you powerful? You think humiliating me in front of everyone makes you a man? Derek tried to laugh it off, but Emma wasn't finished. For 3 weeks, you've been harassing me because I wouldn't go out with you. Because I said no, and you couldn't handle it. So you decided to punish me. To make me pay for having boundaries. The crowd was completely silent now, and Emma could see something shifting in their faces. The entertainment value was fading, replaced by uncomfortable recognition. You want to know why I won't go out with you, Derek? Emma's voice was getting stronger with each word. It's not because I think I'm too good for you. It's because you've shown me exactly who you are. Someone who thinks other people exist for your entertainment. Someone who destroys things when he doesn't get his way. Someone who thinks being popular gives him the right to hurt people. Derek's face was flushed now, but not with anger, with embarrassment. Jake and Tyler were looking anywhere but at Emma, and the crowd was starting to murmur again, but this time the sound was different. Emma turned to address the wider crowd. How many of you have watched someone get bullied and done nothing? How many of you have laughed along because it was easier than standing up? How many of you think this is normal? Her voice broke slightly, but she pushed through. I've been invisible in this school for 4 years. I thought that would keep me safe. But there is no safe when people like Derek think they own you just because you're quiet. Just because you're different. She looked back at Derek, who was now backing away slightly. You ripped my shirt, Derek. But you can't rip away my dignity. You can't destroy who I am. And you definitely can't make me ashamed of saying no to you. The crowd was beginning to disperse, but not in the way it usually did after drama. Students were staying, talking in small groups, looking at Derek and his friends with expressions that ranged from disgust to disappointment. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Mrs. Patterson, the vice principal, had finally arrived, having heard about the commotion. She took one look at Emma's torn cardigan and Derek's guilty expression and immediately understood the situation. "Mr. Morrison, Mr. Patterson, Mr. Brooks, my office, now," she said firmly. Then, more gently to Emma, "Are you all right, dear? Do you need to call your parents?" Emma shook her head. "I'm okay," she said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. "I'm actually okay." The disciplinary consequences for Derek and his friends were swift and severe. Derek was suspended for 2 weeks and banned from all school events for the remainder of the year. Jake and Tyler received similar punishments. But more importantly, the incident sparked conversations throughout the school about bullying, consent, and bystander responsibility. Emma found herself approached by students she'd never spoken to before, some apologizing for their silence, others sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation. The art teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, asked Emma if she'd be interested in creating a mural about finding your voice, which would be displayed prominently in the main hallway. Marcus, her longtime friend, told her he'd never been more proud of anyone in his life. "You didn't just stand up for yourself," he said over lunch in their usual empty classroom. "You made everyone think about who they want to be." But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the incident, Emma found a letter in her locker from Sarah Mitchell, a sophomore she barely knew. "Dear Emma," the letter read, "I was there when Derek tore your shirt, and I was one of the people who just stood there and watched. I've been thinking about what you said about being invisible to stay safe, and I realized that's exactly what I've been doing. But watching you find your voice made me realize that invisible isn't safe, it's just another kind of prison. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to be brave, even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared." The letter was signed by not just Sarah, but 12 other students who had witnessed the incident. They had formed what they called the Speak Up Club, a group dedicated to supporting students who were being bullied and creating a culture where bystanders became allies instead of silent observers. Emma's transformation wasn't immediate or magical. She still preferred quiet corners to crowded hallways, still found her strength in books and art. But something fundamental had changed. She walked taller, spoke clearer, and most importantly, she understood that her voice, quiet as it might be, had power. The torn cardigan became a symbol for Emma, but not of her humiliation. She carefully mended it with bright gold thread, making the repairs visible and beautiful. It became a reminder that being broken doesn't mean being destroyed, and that sometimes the most beautiful strength comes from embracing our scars rather than hiding them. Derek Morrison eventually returned to school, but his social currency had significantly decreased. Students who had once hung on his every word now questioned his character. Teachers who had once overlooked his behavior now watched him more carefully. He had learned, in the most public way possible, that actions have consequences and that popularity without character is ultimately worthless. The incident became known throughout Lincoln High as the day Emma found her voice, though Emma herself preferred to think of it as the day she remembered she'd had one all along. She went on to become valedictorian, earned a full scholarship to study literature and social justice, and maintained the Speak Up Club even after graduation. Years later, Emma would look back on that terrible, transformative moment in the hallway and realize it had been the beginning of her real life. Not because of what Derek had done to her, but because of what she had chosen to do in response. She had turned her pain into power, her vulnerability into strength, and her silence into a voice that could not be ignored. The story of Emma Chen became a reminder to everyone at Lincoln High, and eventually, to people far beyond those walls, that dignity cannot be torn away by someone else's cruelty, that courage can bloom in the most unlikely moments, and that sometimes the quietest voices, when finally raised, can change everything. Emma's journey taught her that being different wasn't something to hide from, it was something to celebrate. Her quiet strength, her thoughtful nature, her artistic soul, these weren't weaknesses to be ashamed of, but gifts to be shared with the world. And in learning to value herself, she had shown others how to find their own voices, their own strength, their own courage to stand up not just for themselves, but for anyone who needed defending. In the end, Derek Morrison had tried to tear her down, but instead, he had given her the opportunity to rise up, not just for herself, but for every student who had ever felt invisible, every person who had ever been told they weren't good enough, and everyone who had ever believed that staying silent was safer than speaking truth. Emma's voice, once barely a whisper, had become a clarion call for dignity, respect, and the unshakable truth that every person deserves to be treated with kindness and humanity. And that voice, once found, would echo through the halls of Lincoln High for years to come, reminding everyone who heard it that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to speak up despite it. What did you think of Emma's incredible transformation? Have you ever had to find your voice in a difficult situation? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else who needs to hear it. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need this message of hope and courage. Don't forget to subscribe to Heartfelt Tales for more inspiring stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that could change your perspective on life. Remember, your voice matters, your story matters, and you have the power to make a difference, just like Emma did. Thank you for being part of the Heartfelt Tales community.